How far did your in-laws go to force a name on your child? My in-laws wanted to name our son after my wife's grandfather, a man named Augustus, and my wife and I had already chosen a name we had chosen together, a name that had come to us one evening and had held since then with the particular permanence of things that are correct. The name we chose was Soren. My in-laws were informed 2 weeks before the birth, which I now understand was 2 weeks more notice than we should have given. My father-in-law Caleb's response to the name was a silence that I counted at 4 seconds, and then he said, "Interesting choice," in a voice that had already moved past the choice to whatever came next, and I noted it and did not act on it, which was my error, because in those 4 seconds he had apparently begun working through a plan, and I had only registered that he was unhappy. My father-in-law Caleb is a quiet, methodical man who treats problems as systems to be navigated, not confronted, and what he began doing immediately after we informed them was not arguing with us. It was preparing an environment in which changing our minds would be the path of least resistance. First was the framing. Every conversation for 2 weeks included a sentence about Augustus, what a legacy he had been, what his name had meant to the family, how much it would have meant to him, delivered not as pressure but as context. And if you heard any one instance in isolation, you'd have called it sentiment, but altogether it had the structure of a brief. Then came the community layer. My in-laws are involved in a church community that is close and attentive, and within a week they had told half that community that the baby would be named Augustus, and cards and gifts began arriving addressed to Augustus weeks before the birth, and my wife would open them, and I would watch her face do the thing it does when she is absorbing something she does not know how to respond to, and I would say nothing, because I was watching the system work. I documented everything. I took photos of the cards. I kept a log of the conversations, because I had started to understand we were dealing with something that would eventually need a record. The dumber they think I am, the more rope they'll hand me. The birth happened on a Tuesday, and our son was born, and we named him Soren, and I held him, and he was exactly himself, and the name was right. When we told my in-laws the name, my mother-in-law cried, which I had expected, and my father-in-law said nothing, which I understood as information. For 3 days, they called the baby Augustus. In the room in front of us, they called him Augustus. My wife addressed it directly on day 2. My father-in-law said he thought she'd change her mind once she held him. My wife said she had held him and he was Soren and would remain Soren. My father-in-law looked at me, specifically at me, with the look of a man filing something away. 2 weeks in, I noticed something. I called the post office because several cards had come with tracking numbers and I wanted to confirm they had been routed correctly, and the woman at the desk mentioned that someone had filed a mail forwarding request for our address 3 weeks prior, routing correspondence addressed to Soren Reed to a PO box. I drove to the records office that afternoon and started pulling. What I found was not the mail forwarding, that was annoying but small. What I found was a court filing, a petition for a legal name amendment filed by a next of kin, framed as a correction of a clerical error, arguing that the intended name of record was Augustus, and that Soren had been filed in error in a moment of post-birth confusion. The filing had been submitted 4 days after my son was born. It had not yet been processed. It named my father-in-law as the petitioner. I sat in a clerk's office with this document in my hands, and I thought about the word clerical error, and I thought about my father-in-law's face when we told him the name. My wife's attorney filed a response before the end of the business day, and the petition was denied, and a letter was sent, and a specific statutory notice about fraudulent court filings was included in the mailing, and we also discovered that the name listed on the baptism certificate my in-laws had pre-filed with the church was Augustus, and that the baptism had been scheduled, without our knowledge, for the following Sunday. My son is Soren. The baptism was canceled. The attorney's file is thick. My father-in-law has not called since the filing. My mother-in-law Emily calls every other day and does not mention Augustus and asks about Soren by name, which I take as the closest thing to acknowledgement we are going to receive. That was 2 months ago. 2 months of something I wanted to call peace, but could only honestly call quiet, because peace implies resolution, and what we had was closer to a pause in a system I had stopped monitoring. Emily called every other day, and every call she asked about Soren by name, and every call I listened from the other room and heard her say it, Soren, like she had decided the word belonged in her mouth now, and I noted it, and I let it matter to me. Emily sent a package in the mail about 3 weeks into the silence, a small knitted blanket, soft and gray, and in one corner she had stitched the letter S in blue thread, and when Min pulled it from the envelope she held it for a long time, and then folded it over the arm of the rocking chair in Soren's room where it has stayed since. I looked at that blanket every morning when I got Soren up, and I let it mean something. Min told me one evening that her mom sounded different on the phone, softer, like something had broken inside her and then reset in a new position, and Min said it with the kind of hope that made me want to protect it even though I wasn't sure I shared it. One night after Soren was asleep, I sat at my laptop and opened the documentation folder, and I moved my cursor over it and right-clicked and looked at the option that said delete, and I sat there for maybe 30 seconds with my finger over the trackpad, thinking about everything in that folder, the photos of the cards addressed to the wrong name, the log of every conversation, the scanned copies of the court filings, the baptism records, all of it, and then I closed the laptop without doing anything. But the fact that I had considered it tells you where my head was. I was ready to be done. Min brought up the Olive Branch dinner about a week later. Small, just dinner at the house, invite her parents. I agreed, and I meant it, but I agreed the way you agree to something when you want to believe the version of the world in which it goes well. The dinner was on a Saturday. Min cooked and Soren was in his high chair, and Emily came in first and hugged Min and said, "There he is, there's my Soren," and her voice was real. Caleb came in behind her, quiet, which is his way, but present, which was different from the silence I had gotten used to. He shook my hand. He looked at the house like he was seeing it for the first time, and I watched him take it in, and I could not tell what he was cataloging, but I noticed that he was cataloging something. Dinner was fine. Emily talked about a show she had been watching and about Soren's blanket and whether he was sleeping through the night, the kind of conversation that families have when they are trying to be families and mostly succeeding. At one point, Caleb reached over, and Emily handed Soren to him, and Caleb held him in that careful way that large men hold small children, and he looked down at Soren and he said, "Hey Soren," and I watched his mouth form the word, and it looked like it cost him something physical, like each letter had a weight he could feel against his teeth, and he said it only once, and then he just held the baby, and I let that single word carry the weight I wanted it to carry. For the first time since all of this started, I thought maybe the file can stay closed. They left around 8. Emily had carried the diaper bag in when they arrived because Min's hands were full, and she carried it back out to the living room at some point during the visit. I didn't think about it because why would I think about it? It was a diaper bag. It had diapers in it. 3 days later, I was packing the bag for a doctor's appointment, and I felt something at the bottom, under the changing pad, that wasn't diapers or wipes or any of the things that live in that bag. It was an envelope, white, unsealed, no postage, no return address. I pulled it out and opened it, and inside were 4 pages of handwriting, neat and careful, and slanted slightly to the left, the way Caleb's handwriting always slants. And at the top of the first page, it said, "My dear Augustus." I read all 4 pages standing in the hallway with the diaper bag at my feet. The letter was written to my son, but not to my son, because it was written to a child named Augustus, and it was written as though the petition had gone through, as though everything that had happened in court and with the attorney and with the baptism had been a minor delay on the way to the correct outcome. It described who the grandfather had been. It described what the name meant, not just as a word, but as an idea, as a thing that was supposed to continue through generations like a thread you don't cut. And the last line, the line that sat at the bottom of the 4th page with space around it like Caleb had wanted it to breathe, said, "One day you will understand why I did what I did, and you will carry this name the way it was meant to be carried." My hands were steady while I read it. My chest was not. I stood there and I thought about Caleb holding Soren at the dinner table and saying his name once, saying the right name, and I thought about Emily carrying the diaper bag in and out, and I thought about the fact that this letter had been sitting under the changing pad for 3 days while I changed diapers on top of it and didn't know, and I understood something with a kind of clean clarity that doesn't come often. The dinner was not an olive branch. It was a delivery system. I called Min into the hallway. I handed her the letter without saying anything because I wanted her to read it without my reaction in the room first. She read all 4 pages. She looked up at me and her face had edges. She said, "He held our son and called him Soren to our faces and then left this in the bag." I walked to the laptop and opened it and found the documentation folder and opened it, and it was all still there. I added the letter to the folder. I was no longer watching the system from the outside. I called the attorney the next morning. She called me back 4 hours later and asked me to come to her office. She had a printout on her desk. Caleb had filed a request with the county family court for something called concerned grandparent standing. She explained it to me. In our state, it's a first step, a way for a grandparent to formally request that a court look into whether visitation rights or, in some cases, a guardianship review is needed. It's the door you open before you walk into those rooms, and Caleb had opened it. The filing included a written statement. Caleb had described me as erratic and controlling. He had written that I had isolated Min from her family, and that the name dispute was evidence of what he called a pattern of unilateral decision-making that excludes the child's maternal family. I read every word twice, and sitting in that office, I understood something that rearranged everything I thought I knew about what this was. Caleb was not fighting about a name anymore. Maybe he hadn't been fighting about a name for a long time. He was building a version of me, a version in which I was the problem, a version in which he was a concerned grandfather being shut out by an unstable son-in-law, and the name was just the proof, just one line in a longer story he was writing for a judge he hadn't met yet. The pastor called Wednesday. Gentle voice, measured, a man used to speaking to people in difficult moments. He said Caleb had reached out and described the situation and asked if the pastor would be willing to help mediate. He said he understood there had been some difficulty around the baby's baptism, and that Caleb felt the child was being kept from the church community. I said, "Pastor, our son has not been denied anything. We chose his name and we will choose when and how he is baptized. My father-in-law filed a legal petition to change our son's name without our consent." Did he mention that? The line went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when someone realizes the story they were told has a hole in it big enough to walk through. He said he had not been aware of that. He said he would not be reaching out again on the matter. I added the call to the log, date, time, what was said. The next day, Min was on the floor with Soren and her phone buzzed and her face went still. She was reading something. Then she looked up at me and said, "He's been calling my cousin." The cousin had screenshotted a conversation with Caleb and texted it to Min. Caleb had written, "Your husband has made it clear that our side of the family isn't welcome. I'm just trying to make sure Augustus, I mean the baby, knows where he comes from." Min read it twice and then said, "You see that, right? He wrote the name first. The correction is fake. He wanted her to see the name." And she was right. It was not a slip. It was placement. Caleb putting the name Augustus into a conversation with someone Min loved, wrapping it in something that looked like a mistake so it would sit in the cousin's mind as the real name, the one the difficult husband had blocked. I called the attorney on Friday. She said the concerned grandparent filing was weak on its own merits and would very likely be dismissed. But then she said the part I didn't want to hear. Right now you have the stronger position, but he's not playing a legal game. He's playing a reputation game, and those are harder to win with paperwork. My friend Dirk came over Friday night. I put everything in front of him, the letter from the diaper bag, the printout of the concerned grandparent filing, the screenshot of Caleb's texts to the cousin. Dirk read each thing slowly, and when he finished, he sat back and looked at me and said, "Documents don't end this. He needs to hear it from you, in a room, with no system to hide behind. And Min needs to be the one who draws the line, because it's her father, and if you do it, he'll use that too." Min was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and she said, "I know." And the way she said it told me she had already arrived at the same place from a different direction, because for her, it was not strategy, it was grief. We planned the conversation that night, the 3 of us, sitting at the kitchen table with the evidence between us like a map of a place we were about to walk into. Min practiced her words once, quietly, looking at the table, and then she looked up and said, "I don't need to practice. I know what to say to my father." They came at 2 o'clock the next afternoon. Emily walked in first, looking like she hadn't slept. Caleb came in behind her, composed, upright, wearing the expression of a man who has prepared for a meeting. Dirk was already in the kitchen, present but not centered. Soren was asleep in his room down the hall. I invited Caleb and Emily to sit at the dining table, and they did. And before anyone said anything else, I placed 3 things on the table between us. The handwritten letter addressed to "My dear Augustus," a printed copy of the concerned grandparent filing from family court, and the screenshot of Caleb's text conversation with Min's cousin. I set them down one at a time, evenly spaced, and I watched Caleb's eyes move across them. He looked at each one and did not react. His hand stayed flat on the table. He looked at me and said, "I see you've been keeping a file on me." I said, "You filed a legal petition to rename my son. You planted a letter in his bag calling him a name that isn't his. You told our pastor I was blocking a baptism. You told Min's family I was cutting them out. I didn't keep a file on you, Caleb. You built one on yourself." His jaw tightened. He said, "Everything I did for this family." Min was sitting next to me and she said, "No, everything you did for a dead man's name." Emily started to cry. She said, "Caleb, please, just stop. Caleb looked at her and something in his face shifted. Not anger, something more like confusion. The look of a man who had walked into a room expecting allies and found the one person he counted on most was not where he left her. He said, Augustus built everything we have. The name means continuity. It means the family goes on. Min stood up from her chair. The family is going on. He's in the next room. His name is Soren. And every time you call him something else, every time you file a paper or write a letter or tell a cousin a story, you are telling me that the name matters more to you than he does. More than I do. Caleb went quiet. I counted. 4 seconds. The same silence from the very beginning. This time I did not wait to see what came after it. I said, I'm going to tell you what happens now. The attorney has flagged your filing as potentially fraudulent, same as the first one. The pastor has been informed of the full situation. Min's cousin has the real version. There is no audience left for the story you've been telling, Caleb. The only people in this room are the people who know exactly what you did. He looked at the table. He looked at the letter he had written. He looked at Emily, who was looking at the floor. He said very quietly, he would have been proud of the name. Min said, maybe, but he's not here, and you are. And right now, you are not someone I'm proud of. Caleb reached across the table and picked up the letter. The 4 pages he had written to a child who does not exist under a name that is not real, and he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood up. He walked toward the hallway. He stopped outside the door to Soren's room, where the light was dim and the sound machine was making its low, steady hum, and he stood there for a long moment looking through the doorway at my son, who was asleep in his crib, exactly himself, with his correct name, in his correct home. I watched Caleb from the table, and I did not get up and I did not stop him, because this was the thing I needed to see. A man standing at the end of every system he had built, every filing and every letter and every whispered conversation, looking at a child, none of it had changed. Caleb said, without turning around, Soren, just the name. He said it once. Then he walked to the front door and opened it and left. Emily stayed for another hour. She held Soren before she left, and she said his name 3 times in 10 minutes, each time like she was practicing something she should have practiced months ago. And before she walked out the door, she looked at Min and said, I should have stopped him sooner. I knew what he was doing, and I told myself it was love. Min said, it might have been, but love doesn't file petitions. That night after Emily left and Dirk went home and the house was ours again, I sat at the laptop and opened the documentation folder and I deleted it. Not because the fight is over, but because the record that matters is not on my laptop. It is in the sound my son makes when he hears his name. Soren is 8 months old. He looks up when you say it. I say it again, just to watch him turn, and he does, every time. The attorney called 2 weeks after the meeting. She said the concerned grandparent filing had been dismissed, which I expected. Then she said something I did not expect, which was that the dismissal had flagged Caleb's name in the state registry, and in pulling the record, the court had found 2 prior filings. Same general claim, different state, different family. She said she wanted me to know before she called anyone else.